Rabbi Nathan Davidovich, speaking to you on behalf of the webyeshiva.org. I'm going to discuss this week's Torah reading, which is the Parsha Ki Taytzay in Devorim. We know that we're coming close to the high holidays, to Rosh Hashanah. Not a coincidence that this particular parsha, this particular Torah reading is read leading up to Rosh Hashanah, as it was the same with last week's parsha. Last week's parsha was Parsha Shoftim, which said, Shoftim v'shotrim titan l'cha b'chol sharech, you shall appoint judges and enforcers in all of your gates. And the commentaries on last week's Parsha say that this refers to how we have to approach the coming of Rosh Hashanah, not waiting until the day of Rosh Hashanah, but during this month of Elul that we're in right now, what we have to do to try to improve ourselves. And this particular Torah reading of Ki Taytzay, this week's Torah reading, has, as well as last week's, has some very interesting messages relating to the renewal of the year. And we're actually going to be talking about Rosh Hashanah and the commandment to not plow with an ox and a donkey together. Now it seems like pretty far stretched to figure out how that would have anything to do with Rosh Hashanah. But stay tuned, I'm going to talk about that. First of all, getting back to what last week's Parsha is. Last week's Parsha is preparing us, telling us that we have 7 openings in our skull. Our eyes, our ears, the 2 nostrils, our mouth, and that we have to use these things appropriately. We have to guard them to not use our senses the wrong way as a preparation for Rosh Hashanah. And then this week's Parsha Ki Taytzay begins with, if you go out, Ki Taytzay le'melchama al oivech, you go out to war against your enemy. And the Meforshim tell us that the greatest enemy are not the physical enemies that we have, but the greatest enemy that we have is the Yetzer Hara, that negative influence that pulls us away from serving God the way we should and pulls us to doing things that are not to God's liking. That's our greatest enemy. And we know that we all personally struggle with, what do we do? How do we overcome desires that maybe not be in our good? So this week's Parsha in Ki Taytzay has an interesting sentence in there that gives an explanation as to what we need to do. One of the things we need to do, and the concept of what we have to do to be able to go through this month of Elul and prepare for Rosh Hashanah. And the Torah says as follows: Lo tachrosh b'shor uvachamor yachtav. You shouldn't plow with an ox and a donkey together. Now, this particular sentence appears just 2 sentences after the sentence that begins, Ki tivne bayit chadash, when you build a new house, v'aseh makya v'yosisev makya lagagecha, you shall put a guardrail around the roof so that nobody falls off. When we talk about bayit chadash, when we talk about chadash, new, we're referring to the new year. Even going back again to last week, where the word the shar, b'chol sha'arecha, the gates, all of your gates. This month of Elul is the Shar, is the gate to not only Rosh Hashanah, but is the gate to the new year. So what is the connection? There's an interesting story that Rabbi Avram Tursky, of blessed memory, brought down. And he told the story about Rav Gershon Henoch, the Rodziner Rebbe, who went to a small city, and he saw a little shul there. He went to this shul, this place of tefillah, and he saw people were talking together, and they seemed very, very angry. So he went up to them, and he said, "What's the matter? What are you angry about?" And they said to him, there's this very wealthy man who's having a wedding for his daughter, and he invited all the people in town, all the rich people in town, but he didn't invite the poor people, and we're angry about that. We live in this town too. We should have been invited to this feast. So the rabbi says, "Come with me." So he goes to the wedding hall, knocks on the door. The butler opens the door and says, "Sorry, only invited guests can come. You can't come into this feast." He said, "No, I'm not here. I'm not here to attend this feast. I'm here to have a very important question to ask your rabbi. And I know your rabbi is there, so I need to talk to him immediately. It's of utmost importance." So, okay, they bring him in before the rabbi. He says, "Yes, how can I help you?" He says, "I have a very important question. Why is it that the Torah tells us not to plow with an ox and a donkey together?" And the rabbi looks at him and says, "This is the important life-saving thing, the important matter that you had to disturb this whole feast for? Everybody knows that we don't look for answers to what God commands. God commands something, we accept it." So the Rodziner Rebbe says, "But Rabbi, if I may, we know that sometimes we can actually find reasons for a particular commandment, and perhaps, excuse me, maybe this is the real reason. Maybe if you have a donkey and an ox plowing together, what happens? The ox chews its cud. It chews the food that is eaten before. And the donkey sees that, doesn't realize what he's doing, and thought that, wow, the owner of both the ox and the donkey fed the ox, but didn't feed me, the donkey." And it felt very bad. So he says, if the Torah is so concerned about even keeping an animal from suffering, he said, then how can you, Rabbi, be sitting in a sumptuous meal when the poor people out there are hungry for food? And he said, "You're right." He immediately invited all the poor people in. This is an example of the Torah teaching us that to be a Jew, to live in this world, we have to have respect not only for animals, but for each other. And when the sentence says when you should create a guardrail for your roof, what it means is that you should put barriers around yourself so that you will see the needs of somebody else, so that you won't forget and think that all you have to do to be a religious person is go to the synagogue on Rosh Hashanah. No. We have to prepare right now, in the month of Elul. Prepare by showing your love for your fellow human beings. That's what it's all about. V'yohavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. I bless all of us to be able to spend the remaining time before Rosh Hashanah improving our own character, introspection of ourselves, to see what we're doing wrong and correct it, so that we don't wait to come to Rosh Hashanah and then start repenting and say, I'm sorry. No, it's got to be done before. Thank you for listening on behalf of the webyeshiva.org. I wish everybody a wonderful Shabbat.